over to the Prime Minister. Would you please all give me a big round of applause for the one and only Randa Abdel Fattah!
Thank you. Okay. I have some pictures. My kids told me they won't want to just listen to a talk. Put some pictures. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're gathered today and pay my respects to elders past and present. So today I just wanted to, I did give a talk last week at another fundraiser. I'm going to repeat some of the words I said there, but in light of some of the things that have happened since then, I have some more to say. I was trying to think as I was sitting there, what is my purpose here in speaking to you all today? Because I know we come to fundraisers and having Nazim, I mean, I came here because of Nazim and Loki actually, and even some of my family told me that they came for Nazim as well. And I love Nazim's energy and I love what we're doing here today, but I want us all to walk away thinking really deeply about why we're here, and that it's amazing to be able to attend a fundraiser and to do our part, but we are really at the beginning of this fight. And every bit of energy that we've brought in the last 7 weeks, I want you to dig deeper past the fatigue, because there's going to be a lot of people who use the last 7 weeks for social capital to suddenly come out and pretend that they're progressive. And as soon as things get a little bit too much for them, they're going to walk away. So we all need to still stay in this and show up, because we are honestly nowhere near at the end line, because the end line is liberation and freedom, not 6th of October. So I wanted to go through, and I think we'll need to turn the lights down a bit for the pictures that my kids insisted I use. I wanted to talk about some things that have come up in the last 7 weeks to just center us again about what we are really challenged with in our narratives. What is the stuff that keeps being thrown at us as tropes, as myths, as arguments, as narratives? And how can we distill these? And the first one, of course, which I'm sure all of you have heard in conversations in the workplace, over the water cooler, is, oh, it's just so complicated. It's just so complex. Next slide, please. This is something that the media loves to use. The idea that this is a complicated conflict. They use the word conflict. And it is so important that we go back to basics. And I know as a nerd that means for me going really back into history, and a lot of people don't want to do that. I've actually sat in media interviews and seen the journalists almost their eyes glaze over or their body stiffen when I start to talk about history. But this is an issue. This is a liberation movement that must start in the late 1800s when the Zionist project was formed. Because if you don't start in the original sin, the originary violence and settler colonialism that we are still dealing with today, that's how you get caught up in the spin doctors thinking that it all started when settlers suffered on the 7th of October. And really, it is so basic. It is just so basic. One group of settlers superimposed through violence and ethnic cleansing and the patronage of imperial colonial powers, a settler minority population over a majority Indigenous population. And the only way they can sustain that project is through violence and demographic control and periodically mowing the lawn, as they call it. And beyond that, the question you need to constantly pose to everybody who uses this, it's complicated, is to say, either you're with that or you're against it. There is no nuance here. There is no grey. You're either with the theft through violence and ethnic cleansing of another people's homeland, or you're not. And anything else that tries to equivocate between those two positions is just justifying ethnic cleansing, settler colonialism, and violence. But of course we know, and I'm not talking about the people who are proudly Zionists, I'm talking about the liberal Zionists, I'm talking about the so-called progressive accept Palestines, the PEPs. I'm talking about those who we usually meet in our workplaces, people who consider themselves on the left. What complicates this so much, and it is something that we come up time and time again, because there is an emotional alliance and allegiance and loyalty from the West because of its complicated relationship with Jews, not because of the Arabs' relationship with Jews, because we are paying the price for their anti-Semitism. We are paying the price for Europe's history of violence and ethnic cleansing and genocide against Jewish populations. And it's because of that they feel unable to criticize Israel. They feel guilted into supporting. And we have no better example of that than Germany, which has the strictest and most draconian anti-protest laws and laws against Palestinian activism than any other country. And it makes sense because we are atoning for their sins. The other thing that we really need to constantly think about is how language has enabled and manufactured consent for Israel's genocide. And the actions of our government in being complicit and in green lighting what is happening. We saw on 7th of October a people break out of a prison that was, by all human rights organizations, both Palestinian, both Israeli, and some of the most well-known human rights organizations in the world, was declared a criminal. The situation in Gaza against international law, a ticking time bomb, a humanitarian disaster. We know all this. And when they broke out of that prison, what did they do? They lit up the colonial buildings of Western societies, including ours, around the world in the colors of the Israeli flag. There was no more, and I'm sure this will be studied for generations to come, there was no more clearer enabling, justification, signaling support for the genocide that was to come than those lights on these buildings. And it was a message projected by Western powers that we stand with you, we stand with Israel, and we stand with you in what you're going to do next. And that was all they needed. And we have seen the unprecedented violence that has been unleashed, but it was Western societies that gave them the bullets and Israel pulled the trigger. And we should never forget the West in enabling, funding, patronage, support for this genocide. We see the way that Western governments and the media constantly try to frame this as Israel versus Hamas. We are all sick and tired of that binary, because what it does is immediately erases the settler colonial history of 75 years. It erases the situation of Palestinians as refugees. It erases the violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the Palestinians in Israel who are second-class citizens. And it immediately denies our liberation movement its full context and history. It also serves to immediately position this as a kind of situation where Israel is against a so-called terror organization and buying into the language of the war on terror. We are seeing constantly that the way that governments are siding with Israel is to constantly reaffirm this so-called right to defend itself, even though it has no basis in international law, because Israel is the occupying power and in fact is obligated to protect the people that it occupies. Yet even if we take it on their face value, on their terms, we ask how many deaths is an acceptable number for self-defense in pursuing it. When you are witnessing one of the most calculated examples of naked brutality in modern history, and all of this has been overwhelmingly and shamelessly supported by Western states. What makes it even more shameful is that every single thing has been documented, every metric, every statistic. We see it all live streamed on TikTok, on WhatsApp, in our news feeds. There is no denying what Israel is doing, and yet they still answer, Israel has the right to defend itself, which reads as Israel has the right to bomb a hospital, Israel has the right to bomb a UN school, Israel has the right to bomb a refugee camp, Israel has the right to starve a population, Israel has the right to use white phosphorus, Israel has the right to kill over 6,000 children. This is what we are up against. And in doing so, in constantly reaffirming solidarity with Israel, in the face of this bloodlust of a regime, the unfathomable brutality, the carpet bombing, we are seeing so-called progressive governments, like our so-called Labour government, headed by the guy who considers himself to have grown up on Struggle Street, and our foreign minister, who we will never allow to use the word intersectionality, because we understand, and we have always understood, that representation does not mean good politics. They have enabled genocide. We are seeing the constant invocation of anti-Semitism and the fear that Jewish communities are feeling. We do not deny that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And yet, first of all, they only seem concerned in the context of Palestine, not when neo-Nazis are walking down the streets of Melbourne at the time of COVID, not when neo-Nazis start to talk about one nation and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Suddenly there's no concern for the safety of Jewish communities. And yet when it comes to Palestine, we, the occupied, the bombed, are the threat. What this also serves to do is deny the voices and agency of anti-Zionist Jews. It is anti-Semitic to assume that every Jewish person has allegiance to Israel. That is anti-Semitic in itself. And while we're at it, I never once heard a politician talk about concern for Russians in Australia at the time Russia invaded Ukraine, because we do never ever privilege the concerns and emotions of the occupier or those who stand to support genocide. We privilege the grief, we privilege the lives of those who are the victims. We should not have to care how a Zionist feels because two people on a stage at Sydney Theatre company wore keffiyehs. And the company yesterday came out and apologised for distressing people in the audience. You know what? My job as a Palestinian is to cause a Zionist distress. I hope you are distressed. I hope you are uncomfortable. And today, in the context of all this narratives about defending Israel and right to exist, we had Penny Wong come out and say that she had met with a family from Gaza. And she said, "This week I met with an Australian family who left Gaza with the help of the Australian government. Thank you to all the officials who made sure they made it home safe. The family is among 131 Australians, permanent residents and their families, who have helped leave Gaza. I honestly don't know how these people sleep at night. I'm never going to appeal to them on moral terms. I'll appeal to them in terms of how humiliating it must be to write something so ludicrous when you have, for 7 weeks now, championed a genocidal campaign and caused the conditions in which these people need to flee Gaza, not to mention all of those who remain. All of those who remain in conditions, these appalling conditions of unsafety, and yet you still have the gall to write that. So we know that language is the enabling factor here, and we can never ever forget the correlation between this sort of language and the rising death toll. Every single week of this last 7 weeks that I've given a speech, anytime you have spoken in public or spoken with your peers or spoken to anybody or colleague, you have had to amend the death toll. Every single day it goes up. That is not normal. We should not accept that. We should not accept the fact that we wake up in the morning looking at our phones expecting another massacre. That is not normal, and we should not ever think that this is a normal situation to have to confront crimes against humanity minute by minute by minute without raising our voices. And of course we know that, so I'm going to be a bit longer, I'm just getting started. But what's very frustrating as well, and we all know this, is the conditions of the war on terror have enabled Palestinians, children for goodness sakes, to be criminalized as terrorists. And there is an appetite in the public for this kind of a narrative because the war on terror has for so long manufactured this slippage between Palestinian, Muslim, Arab and terrorist. And we see it time and time again in the way that Israel quickly labels everyone in Gaza as a terrorist. That if you stand with Israel, you stand against terrorism. Clearly borrowing from the language of George Bush. Invoking the idea that Hamas equals ISIS. I will never forget in 2017 when the New South Wales Police conducted a counter-terrorism training exercise at Central Station, and those police officers who were simulating stabbing people, holding them as hostages, were dressed up wearing a keffiyeh. And when that was brought to the New South Wales Civil and Administrative Tribunal, there was a decision that racially vilified Palestinians. But the crucial terrorist signifier, the keffiyeh, the way that the police justified it has never left me. They said that it was purchased from an army disposal shop as part of a non-specific mix of criminal terrorist-style items of clothing. What a collapse of breathtaking proportions of language. It's almost like the keffiyeh represents a one-size-fits-all terrorist. And this is what we are dealing with, that kind of imagery and labeling of Palestinian resistance, of Palestinian agency, of any time you see a Palestinian who isn't dying and crying, is immediately constructed as a terrorist. And we see this in the way that pro-Palestinian protesters are maligned and demonized as siding with terror or as violent or as scaring the rest of the population. But we know that this serves a purpose, that this plugs into a multi-billion-dollar military-industrial complex in which Israel exports its weapons which are battle-tested in real time in the Gaza, in the West Bank, and used against black bodies, indigenous bodies, brown bodies in the Western societies. I'll never forget reading that during the Ferguson, Missouri protests, the police officers used a liquid called skunk, which causes nausea when sprayed onto protesters, and it was actually manufactured by Israeli police and an Israeli company. So these kind of, they call it the Deadly Exchange Program. This is why our leaders are so unwilling to stand up against genocide, because genocide is profitable. It's a good investment. So our job is to make it a bad investment through boycotts, divestment, sanctions, direct action. Just a few more points about the humanitarian pause. We'll call it pausing genocide, as so many people have argued, because there's something particularly disgusting and shameful about actually gloating and rejoicing and celebrating you offering us a pause in your genocide. And we all know also that during that so-called pause, Palestinians are still being killed, even shot at as they are trying to flee to so-called safe areas. We know that the pause has not enabled them to bury their dead, to look for the people who might still be alive buried under the rubble. We know that during the pause, a hospital was bombed, a school. And we know that when a person is being tortured, you want an end to the torture, not a break, so that your torturer can go and retool or sharpen their tools. So everything about this is monstrous. And the fact that people like Penny Wong and Anthony Albanese and other Western leaders expect us to be grateful that they're supporting a humanitarian pause is shameful. So too, this idea of a prisoner exchange. We should refuse and repudiate the language of prisoner, because the Palestinians who are in Israeli jails are hostages. 5,000 of them, 160 children are hostages. They are there without charge or trial. And if they are placed in administrative detention, it can be renewed. You do not have the opportunity to see the evidence used against you. There's a 99.9% success rate. They are tried in military courts. There are children in there. But of course we know that for the Israeli machinery, propaganda machinery, and mainstream media, a Palestinian child is described in a very different way to an Israeli child, to a Jewish child. Our childhood is cut at a much shorter age. We are considered, they'll use the word teenagers, for example. They will do everything they can to try and detract from the fact that they are holding children hostages. The fact that Palestinian corpses are held hostage and Palestinian families don't have the ability or right to bury their family and loved ones. This is all missing. The fact that since the start of this 4-day truce, Israel released, I think, about 117 Palestinians. The numbers keep changing, but they've also incarcerated 116 from the occupied West Bank. And we also know that in other prisoner swaps, hostage swaps, Palestinians who are released are re-arrested and imprisoned shortly after. And of course the media will not bother or care to report on that. Today, we hear again the ridiculous language of two-state solution. It is flogging a dead horse. Even Penny Wong tweeted today, "We want to see the next steps towards a sustainable ceasefire, but it cannot be one-sided. We must all work towards a long-term enduring peace that requires a two-state solution." Again, words that are so callous, so obviously inept and ill-equipped to describe what is happening, that we know that this is just rhetoric masquerading as foreign policy. And we know that it is a morally bankrupt government and a rhetorical shield. Likewise, from the river to the sea, which we know efforts are being made to criminalise, to deem as anti-Semitic, as a call for wiping Israel off the face of the planet. We know that this is a projection of Israel and its disease. It is a disease that can only think of existing through the destruction of another people, whereas we have proven we can coexist as a people without killing Jews, without killing Christians. We have thousands of years of history of coexistence. And so when they say from the river to the sea threatens them, it's because they cannot understand that you can live as a people in peace without having to do so dependent on the destruction of another people. And so it really does reflect the logic and psychology of the colonizer throughout history, which is the constant perennial fear that the colonized will do to them what they have done and continue to do to the people that they subjugate. And that is all that we are dealing with when it comes to Israel. My last point is to read two very short poems. One is from Musab Abu Toha, who was recently arrested, but alhamdulillah was returned after being beaten up by Israel. I met Musab at the Palestine Rights Festival in September in Philadelphia, and it was surreal to then read of his arrest. His poem, What a Gazan Should Do During an Israeli Airstrike, isn't long, but I would like to read it to you. Turn off the lights in every room. Sit in the inner hallway of the house, away from the windows. Stay away from the stove. Stop thinking about making black tea. Have a bottle of water nearby, big enough to cool down children's fear. Get a child's kindergarten backpack and stuff, tiny toys and whatever amount of money there is, and the ID cards, and photos of late grandparents, aunts or uncles, and the grandparents' wedding invitation that's been kept for a long time. And if you are a farmer, you should put some strawberry seeds in one pocket and some soil from the balcony flower pot in the other, and hold on tight to whatever number there was on the cake from the last birthday. And the last poem I want to read, Marwan Nahul. And this is a poem I chose after an argument with someone at work who said, "Can you be less political?" to me. In order for me to write poetry that isn't political, I must listen to the birds. And in order to hear the birds, the warplanes must be silent. I want to end by acknowledging everyone here today who has lost someone in Gaza. It is not normal for us to sit on our phones every day and read eulogy after eulogy, message after message. I have lost 20 members of my family. I have lost 15 members of my family. I have lost 10 members. I do not know where this person is. And what makes this so painful for us is that most of society seems to live as though nothing is happening. And what they don't realize is this genocide that is unfolding does not just affect Palestinians. This has changed the entire global order and shown us what are we as a human race prepared to accept and what are we prepared to stand up against. And I hope that, well, I know that everyone here today stands up firm and strong, and I feel very deeply honoured to be standing beside you all. Thank you.